Dear doctors, we are live.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the PCO Society of India, I am delighted to bring you this next episode of the W3 webinar series, What, When, and Why. This evening, we will discuss gestational diabetes mellitus, also popularly called GDM, which is a problem that we are increasingly facing in our practice. And to discuss this issue, we have with us this evening a galaxy of experts. We have from obstetricians, endocrinologists, pediatrician, all to discuss both the preventive as well as the management of this difficult condition. So do you want, this program is brought to you by the PCO Society of India with support from our corporate partners, USV Private Limited. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce our founder president of the PCO Society of India, Dr. Duru Shah. She is a truly dynamic personality who has held many prestigious posts. She has been the past president of the ISAR, of the FOXI, of the Mumbai Obstetric Gynec Society, and the Indian Menopause Society. She is also a trustee of the Mumbai Obstetric Gynec Society. Her work has been acknowledged both nationally as well as internationally. And Madam is a truly versatile personality. She has worked on the subject of adolescent health, and together we have done many school programs. She has also worked on the subject of menopause, and now she is heading the PCO Society of India. She is a board member of Aspire. She is the immediate past chair of the Special Interest Group on Reproductive Endocrinology and PCO at Aspire. And she is an international advisor to the European Society, ESHRE. I now would like to play a video message from Dr. Duru Shah.
Hi, I'm Dr. Duru Shah, the founder president of the PCOS Society of India. The society is of multidisciplinary experts in the field of gynecology, dermatology, endocrinology, and all the allied specialists who look after PCOS women. We all are focused on creating awareness on PCOS, both amongst doctors and updating their knowledge. And we are also wanting to create the awareness amongst women at large for them to understand what they are having and what their problem is. In short, our organization is consisting of experts, both from India, and we also have members from outside the country. It's important for all of you to be with us and join us in our endeavor to upgrade our knowledge in this field and reach out to our patients so that they have a better quality of life in future. Thank you.
With that, I like to begin our program. I am Dr. Sarita Bhalerao. I am a member of the Managing Council of the PCO Society, and I'm also president of the Mumbai Obstetric and Gynecological Society. And the subject of PCO and GDM is very close to my heart. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Shilpa Agarwal. Dr. Shilpa Agarwal is a specialist in high-risk pregnancy. She's attached to the Jaslok Hospital and to the SRCC Children's Hospital, Mumbai. She has completed her fellowship, FNB in high-risk pregnancy and fetal medicine from the Fernandez Hospital, Hyderabad. And she is also specially trained in fetal ultrasound from Mediscan, Chennai and Fernandez Hospital. She has worked in the areas of genetic counseling. She has a special interest in managing high-risk pregnancies and recurrent pregnancy loss. And her areas of specialization are genetic counseling, pre-pregnancy counseling, and perinatology. And she's a true academician with many book chapters, publications, and presentations to her credit. Welcome, Dr. Shilpa Agarwal, and I request you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, madam, for such kind words. Thank you so much. Thank you, Durusha, madam, for giving us this opportunity to do this session, the W3 series. We are really happy to do this. Now, let us see the galaxy of stars we have today with us. So can I have the next slide? So to start with the endocrinologist, we have Dr. Jugal Gada, and he is attached to many hospitals, Bhatia, Bridge Candy, Kambala Hill, and at Hormone and Core Clinic, Mumbai. He is assistant professor in endocrinology at Nair Hospital, a principal and co-investigator in national and international clinical trials, an avid researcher and writer. He has peer reviewer for many Indian journals and a teacher involved in phenotyping and genotyping growth hormone deficiency in India and continuous glucose monitoring technology related research. His research interest areas are growth disorders, obesity, and metabolic disorders and diabetes. He is a recipient of a prestigious A.V. Gandhi Award for Best Clinical Thesis 2018. We welcome you, Dr. Jugal, and we look forward to hearing from you. Our next expert is Dr. Sangeeta Agarwal. She is a consultant obstetrician and gynecologist at Bhatia Hospital, and she is a founder member and joint honorary secretary of the PCOS Society of India. Her areas of interest are obstetrics and gynecology, endocrinology, menopause management, and fertility control. We welcome you, Dr. Sangeeta. Our next expert is Dr. Vineet Samdani. He is a consultant pediatrician. You name the hospital, he's there: Bridge Candy Hospital, HN Hospital, Sefi Hospital, Bhatia, and SRCC. We welcome you, Dr. Vineet. And we have our presenter, Dr. Sneha. She is a DNB trainee at Sefi Hospital. So we welcome you, Sneha, and we can start with our case presentation. So we will be having our cases first, and then we will move on to our discussion. Sneha, we can share the slides.
Yeah, Sneha, you can go into slide show. Go into view and you'll get slideshow. Yeah. Oh, lovely. Yeah, Sneha, you need to unmute yourself. Yeah. Are you not able to unmute yourself? No.
Dr. Sneha, you can click on the message which you are showing it in the screen. Just click on that. I cannot hear you.
I think she's having some trouble unmuting herself.
Dr. Sneha, are you getting a message in your system?
On your screen?
Yes, Dr. Sneha is getting a notification in her screen. Just click
Okay.
on accept.
No, I think she's. What's happened to the share screen? Can you share screen, please?
Dr. Sneha, can you unmute now and share the screen again?
I think her internet seems to have.
Doctor, I will be sharing it from our
Yeah,
side.
yeah. Shobit, you share the screen and I'm starting the case. Yeah. Okay. So we are going to discuss two cases, and I'm going to start with the first case. Yeah, Sneha, are you there? Can you unmute? No. Okay, next.
Shobit, can you call her on her phone and see?
Yeah. Shobit will call her. Tab tak, Shilpa, do you want to start with the case?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, next slide. You got it. Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Please start.
Can you see the screen, ma'am? I'm sharing.
Yes, we can see.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Sneha from Saifi Hospital. Today, I will be presenting two cases. The first one is purely gestational diabetes mellitus with a more compliant and well-educated patient with a better outcome. And the second one is more of a pre-gestational diabetes mellitus with a less compliant patient belonging to the lower socioeconomic status with a poorer outcome. Coming to the first case, she is 31-year-old female homemaker from Colaba. She is gravida 2 with one living issue, 38 weeks of gestational age. Her blood group is O positive. Coming to her history of present pregnancy, her pregnancy was confirmed with a UPT at around 6 weeks of amenorrhea. And it was a spontaneous conception. Dating scan was done.
Sorry to interrupt, Sneha. Just move the slide. No, it is not going.
Ma'am, I'm not able to move the slide.
Click on the slide.
Doctor, I'm sharing the slide from our side. Tell us just to change the slides.
Yeah, please change the slide now. Yeah, coming to her history of present pregnancy, it was a spontaneous conception and it was diagnosed by urine pregnancy test at around 6 weeks of amenorrhea. Dating scan was done and she took the folic acid also. OGTT had done as soon as the pregnancy diagnosis was said to be normal. Her first trimester screening was low risk and quickening was felt at the 5th month of amenorrhea. She was immunized with 2 doses of tetanus toxoid. She took the hematinics. She took the hematinics and calcium tablets as well. And anomaly scan done was normal. There was no history suggestive of any polyuria or polydipsia. She continued perception of fetal movement in the 3rd trimester as well. And the OGTT repeated at around 28 weeks of gestation was said to be positive.
Next slide.
The blood sugars were more than 125 milligram per deciliter. HbA1c was 5.8. She was advised medical nutrition therapy and lifestyle modification at that time for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, 2-hour postprandial blood sugar done was more than 150 milligram per deciliter. And she was started on injection insulin 6 and 6 unit in the morning, lunch and the dinner. After starting insulin, patient was doing self-monitoring of the blood glucose at home and it was under control. 32-week growth scan was said to be normal. Obstetric scan done again at the 36 weeks shows the AFI of 12. Expected fetal weight was around 2.9 kg plus minus 600 grams.
Next slide.
Coming to her obstetric history, she is married for 4 years. The first conception was also a spontaneous conception and antepartum, intrapartum and the postpartum period was uneventful. And no significant medical or surgical history and no significant family history. Coming to the diet history, she consumes a mixed diet with 3 major meals and the 2 snacks. The total calorie intake by her is around 2200 kilocalorie and the total protein intake was around 55 grams per day as per the 24-hour recall method. The calorie deficit was around 380 kilocalorie and the protein deficit was around 16 grams. And on general physical examination, her height was 164 centimeter. The pre-pregnancy weight was 72 kg. Pre-pregnancy BMI was around 26.84 kg per meter square, and which fall in the overweight. And her weight gain during the pregnancy was around 8 kg, which was optimal for her weight. And vitally, she was stable. And by obstetric examination, we could conclude that we had a single intrauterine live gestation with longitudinal lie in cephalic presentation in latent labor. Now coming to the second case, she is 30-year-old female from the low socioeconomic status. She is also She is also a homemaker. She studied till 12th. Her obstetric score is gravida 3, abortion 2. Coming to her past history, Her first pregnancy was during the first year of her marriage. That was a IUFD at 24 weeks. And she had not taken any antenatal care, and it was not further evaluated. The second pregnancy also, she conceived in the first year of her marriage only. That was also induced abortion at around 3rd month of amenorrhea in view of anencephaly, as it was diagnosed in the first scan at around 10-12 weeks. Coming to the present pregnancy, she has not taken any preconceptional care, and she has not taken any antenatal care till she came to our hospital at around 18 weeks. That time she was screened for GDM, and the OGTT was abnormal. For that, she was given a medical nutrition therapy and the lifestyle modification for around 2 weeks. And again at 20th week, she was re-evaluated for her sugars, which was again high, and she was again started on the insulin Novorapid 6, 6 and 6 units. And again, it was re-evaluated at around 32 weeks. She is coming to our hospital with a high sugar level, and she has been at the insulin level is increased to 12-12-0 Novorapid, and Novomix is added 0014. Her anomaly scan done was also normal, and now she's being admitted in our hospital for the further management and the sugar control. The USG done at this moment shows AFI of 15 centimeter with abdominal circumference of more than 90th centile. Expected fetal weight around 2.5 kgs.
So with that, we'll now go to the questions. And can I have the next slide, please? And yeah, and my first question, of course, is about the burden of disease. And I'm going to ask this to our different disciplines. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Sangeeta. Do you feel that you are seeing more pregnant patients with diabetes, whether it's gestational or overt? Sangeeta, you need to unmute yourself. I think you can unmute her.
Yeah, India is so known as the diabetic capital of the world. So we do have a lot of diabetes burden in the country. And therefore, by the very fact being Indian, pregnant women who they are in the high risk category, and therefore we need to screen for them. And yes, we are seeing a lot of gestational diabetics and overt diabetics in pregnancy. We also have a lot of PCOS in the country, which also contributes to the burden.
So I'm going to ask Dr. Jugal Gada now, what do you think from your practice? Do you think prevalence of gestational diabetes is 14.3%?
I think probably it would be a little more if we start even much more rapidly. So obesity has been, I think, one of the biggest epidemics right now in the last decade. And with that, with the Indian genetics, and as Sangeeta ma'am said, number of diabetics in India have been growing. And females also have PCOD, late conception. All this becomes a little risk factor in increasing the prevalence. And obviously now we've started also screening a little more. The glucometers have become very handy. A lot of guys are just checking at home, and they've been getting diagnosed, especially in the earlier stages of the first trimester or something. So I think this could be pretty much a good figure, or probably a little underplayed, I would say. Probably it could be a little even more than this.
Okay, Dr. Vinit Samdani, now you've been in practice for the last 20-25 years. Do you feel that even the neonates are coming with problems related to infants of diabetic mothers?
Oh, absolutely. So we always know that infants of diabetic mother have increased risk 3 to 4 times on a neonate. And neonates would come with multiple complications, preterm labor, respiratory distress. We have macrosomia issues, we have metabolic issues in them, and we have also structural malformations and cardiac issues. So yes, infants of diabetic mothers do give us a lot of issues once the baby is born.
Okay. And Shilpa, now a question to you is this across the board, whether it is low socioeconomic or high socioeconomic? Is it across, or is it particularly in any particular area?
It is across the board. It doesn't is restricted to any socioeconomic strata, but it is all over.
Okay.
As
So
Dr.
the
Sangeeta said, an epidemic of diabetes.
diabetes, obesity, yes.
Yeah.
So next slide, please. Shobit, I'm not able to see the slides now. I think something has changed in the view. Yeah. So let's go to the next slide, please. And the next slide is the question about definition, which is again a very, very controversial area. I'm going to start with Dr. Shilpa. And how do we define gestational diabetes?
So gestational diabetes basically is it's a continuation of a chronic beta cell dysfunction which is there. So if we see by American Diabetes Association, it is the recent guideline says that it is the diabetes which is diagnosed in second and third trimester. So basically we are excluding the overt diabetes from this definition, and we are just taking the gestational induced diabetes. So earlier we used to say that the one which are diagnosed first or occurred first in pregnancy. But yes, now the definition is second or third trimester.
Okay. Dr. Jugal, coming to you, I mean, do you think that this is a really clear definition, or is there a lot of overlap?
No, so ma'am, we need to differentiate the two, because having diagnosed diabetes in the first trimester has its own different implication. And
Okay.
the ADA, as ma'am rightly pointed out, said any diabetes diagnosed first in the pregnancy was defined as GDM. So that was creating a lot of confusion, because the implication of someone diagnosed in second, third trimester is little, different. So I think clarifying that, GDM would be the true gestational diabetes, which is part and parcel of the insulin resistance and the beta cell secretion, which goes a little abnormal, would make sense. So that actually now I think the clarity is better, because we know a first trimester diabetes needs to be treated which much more, much more aggressively, getting their sugars much better controlled in the future. I mean,
Correct.
the fetal part of the story becomes really very important there.
So you did touch a little bit on the beta cell function, but can you tell us in simple terms what predisposes and why pregnancy is diabetogenic?
Okay, so as we start off the pregnancy, normally what we see is there is slight dip in the sugars, and slowly as the gestational age increases, at around 18th week, there is a transformation and the insulin resistance starts increasing. By 24 week, the insulin resistance is at its peak, and the mother's metabolism shifts, and now the baby wants to gain weight. So there is a complete turnover, and the fat metabolism is what starts changing, and the beta cells try to overcome the insulin resistance there. And if there is a component of pre-diabetes, or the beta cells are already stressed, then they may not be able to overcome that higher insulin resistance, and the patient will precipitate as a GDM.
Okay. And Sangeeta, you did mention something right in the beginning about PCO. So what is the link between PCO and GDM? You need to unmute yourself.
PCOS, we know that, there are multiple factors which contribute to the whole syndrome, and insulin resistance is known to be the most basic, most important factor. And therefore, patients who have PCOS have a certain degree of insulin resistance, and that same is present even when they are pregnant, and therefore it will lead to diabetes in pregnancy, be it gestational or whether they are diabetic from even before they get pregnant.
Okay.
So it is the insulin resistance which is the common factor.
Common factor. So Vinit, coming to you, does it matter whether the mother, whether it's an infant of a gestational diabetic or an overt diabetic? What do you think? Does it matter? Does your management change, or does the prognosis outcome change?
Oh, absolutely. So if the mother is a type 1 diabetic before conception, then we have more chances in the first trimester to encounter something known as diabetic embryopathy, where there are congenital anomalies on the child. Whereas if you come into the gestational diabetes, which usually happens in the second trimester onwards, you have diabetic fetopathy, which has multiple other common issues that can be tackled at birth. But embryopathy, we usually lose the child at birth, or they are born with multiple congenital anomalies.
Okay. So can I have the next slide, please? Let's go ahead now. And I think Sangeeta did mention that India is the diabetic capital of the world. And now we come to screening for gestational diabetes. And this is, I know I can see Dr. Jugal Gada smiling because the endocrinologists feel differently and the obstetricians feel differently about this. But do we all agree that universal screening should be done in our country? Yes, and I can see that everybody's nodding their heads. So now we come to how to screen. So Shilpa, I'm going to ask you to set the ball rolling.
Yeah. So the screening in diabetes, in pregnancy for diabetes, basically we are following the DIPSI guidelines.
Next slide.
Diabetes in pregnancy study group, India. So the guidelines says that it is a universal screening.
Next slide.
As we all mentioned, it's a universal screening. And so as soon as the patient comes to us, we should be doing a diabetic screen. So that is how the first encounter with our patient, we should be doing a screening test, and it is without a fasting blood sugar. We just give her, irrespective of her fasting status, we give her 75 grams of glucose, and we do a sample after 2 hours, and we take the cutoff as 140. So that is how we screen our mothers. And again, we screen them. If that is negative, we screen them at 24 and 28 weeks. As Dr. Jugal mentioned, that the insulin resistance again rises after 24 weeks. So we have to screen our mothers again at 24 to 28 weeks so that we don't miss out on the late development of gestational diabetes.
Jugal, what is your take on this?
So ma'am, initially during the first trimester or the first visit, you can use your normal OGTT, that is 0 and 2 hours, and follow the normal adult guidelines for the non-pregnant women or the males that we have, the general guidelines for diabetes diagnosis. At 24 weeks is usually where we usually recommend the screening for the GDM. There have been a lot of debates regarding the 1-step and the 2-step approach. So 1 step is where we are using the new IDPSG guidelines, 75 gram glucose. You have to call the patient fasting, do a 0, 1, 2 hours, use the cutoff, which is 180, 152, and the fasting of 95. So 92. However, there has been one new article in NEJM published just, I think, a couple of months back, where they have compared the 2-step versus the 1-step approach. And what they've done is they followed up the final neonatal and the perinatal complications. And they found no difference between the two, excepting that the 1-step approach that we've been following picks up much more GDMs and increases much more visits. However, their 2-step approach is a little different than the DIPSI, where they advise a 50 gram glucose challenge, and the cutoff they kept was 135 or 140, rather than the one that we're using is a 75 gram glucose challenge. So I think very soon you might see a little shift in the international guidelines also approving the 2-step approach as well.
Yeah. So I think the reason that the DIPSI guidelines said that do just one single blood test is to make it simple. And I still remember Dr. Hema Divakar, when she was FOGSI president, she told us that when the patient is sitting outside in your waiting room, you give them sugar and you do the blood test. So that we pick up more and more patients and we make it logistically simpler, because the moment you tell patients 3 blood time blood lena hai, they are not willing. I don't know, Dr. Sangeeta, have you faced that in your practice?
Yes, so I do use the DIPSI method, but because we are in an urban place and we do a lot of other blood tests for the patient fasting, invariably we do CBC, thyroid, blood group, etc., and HIV, HBS screening, rubella, etc. So at the first visit, we invariably have a fasting level because we are doing so many other things. And then we do this 75 gram glucose and 2-hour blood check. There are times when people find it very inconvenient to go after 2 hours. And therefore, for those patients, we tell them that, okay, on another day, you can get up in the morning, have your 75 gram glucose, and then do the blood test. And suppose they don't do the sugar test with on the same day as the fasting and they come to the clinic, then we can do this DIPSI in the clinic itself. So yes, it has a role, but most of the time in urban places, we are having the fasting and the 2-hour post glucose.
Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. So should the guidelines be different in India? Do you think, Dr. Shilpa?
Yes, definitely we should have, because our incidence and prevalence is very high as compared to others. And we don't, our patients are basically, also we have lower socioeconomic status where they do not are very compliant. So we want them to be compliant and prevent all the complications. So yes, it should be a separate guidelines for India.
Yeah, next slide, please. What about the role of HbA1c, Dr. Jugal? Any role of HbA1c?
So, in the first trimester, the HbA1c does pretty well. It's only in the second and third trimester, we don't have a normative range specifically cut off for the A1C, because A1C will get affected with iron deficiency, improvement in red cell turnover, or even in the change in the hemodilution that happens as a part of the normal pregnancy range. So A1C is not a robust marker for the second and third trimester at all. In the early first trimester, I think it becomes a good marker to pick up, overt diabetes.
Okay. So now let's go ahead, and we'll start with the preconceptional counseling. And I'd like to ask our gynecologist, Dr. Sangeeta, how do you counsel these patients?
So, yeah, for the preconception counseling, the first, if you see a patient who is at a high risk, then first let's define who are the high risk patients. They are the ones who have a family history of diabetes, or they themselves have had a previous pregnancy and have had macrosomia, stillbirth, etc., or have been detected to have diabetes during that pregnancy, or if they are now just planning for the first time, then they are the ones who have PCOS, have obesity. So I would counsel them that do their checks, sugar checks, tell them to try to achieve modify their lifestyle, go on a good diet, try to achieve optimal weight, and to achieve optimal glycemic control. If they are on medications which are not likely to be possible to continue during pregnancy, I would like to put them on medication which is safe for pregnancy. And we all know we have been using metformin and glyburide during pregnancy. So get the best diabetes control, weight control, lifestyle, and then allow them to get pregnant. And of course, add folic acid before they get pregnant.
Okay, wonderful. So now I'm just going to go to one or two of the audience questions that we have. And this one question is related to interpretation of the GCT. And Dr. P. Reena Prabha from Kokila is asking what to do if the GCT is 146. So we'll ask Dr. Shilpa first, and then Dr. Jugal, what is your opinion?
So GCT of 146, yes, we have taken the cutoff. See, if we take cutoff as 130, so we will overtreat them. And if we take a cutoff 140 for GCT, we are obviously missing on someone who is between 130 and 140. So yes, 146, I'm going to take this as a marker where I have to monitor this patient, and she obviously is more than 140. So she comes into that category of impaired glucose tolerance. So I'm going to do a HbA1c to see whether it is just an incident now or it was there high before also. So I'm going to add on HbA1c, and I'm going to do a fasting and post-lunch sugars also for her.
Dr. Jugal, what is your take on this? Because you said HbA1c in the second trimester, you don't advise much.
Yeah, so ma'am, in this, usually what we would go ahead with a fasting or a post-lunch if it's not convenient to do a proper OGTT, which is 75 grams 0, 1 and 2 hours with fasting, and confirm the diagnosis very likely with, as ma'am said, more than 150. The specificity is also very high that this is going to be like a GDM, and then treat her as a GDM.
Okay. So you do a fasting and a post-lunch sugar, and then treat based on the fasting and post-lunch. Is that, yeah?
Yeah, ideally would be OGTT. If not, then at least a fasting post-lunch should definitely help when it's 146.
Okay. Next slide, please. Let's go ahead now. And so these are all the, the risk factors, etc., in patients that we should be very careful about. I think we've gone into most of these PCOS, obesity, etc. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now, so no known risk factors are seen in 50% of GDM, which is why we need to really, really screen our patients very carefully, and screening has to be universal across the board. Next slide, please. Fine. I think Sangeeta has described this, has discussed this very well. So we won't go back to this. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I'm going to ask Dr. Shilpa now to explain this slide to us.
Yeah. So basically, this is a graph which shows how HbA1c is related or is proportional to fetal anomalies. So we have to have our HbA1c and see the level of HbA1c, and we can obviously prognosticate, or we can counsel the patient that what is the percentage or what is the probability of having a fetal malformation. So whenever we have HbA1c less than 7, that is what we usually say, the possibility of fetal malformation is very less. And having said that, even if it is, I had a patient with HbA1c of 9.5, but that doesn't mean that she's definitely going to have problems.
Right.
So we are going to counsel them that yes, HbA1c is an indicator where the malformations are high, but that doesn't mean that all of them will have malformations.
So when you say high, what do you mean? Now
22. So if it is more than 10%, if it is more than 10 HbA1c, then the chance of having a fetal malformation is close to some 22%. So we have to counsel them in that way, that the percentage is high, but yes, the normal is 80%. So we can always tell them in a positive way rather than telling them in a negative way.
Negative way, that's true. Dr. Vinit, I'm going to bring you in at this stage because you did talk about embryopathy. So do you agree with this, that, you know, when the HbA1c is 10 or more, that the risk is almost 1 in 4?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So well-controlled diabetic to a poorly controlled diabetic who's going to deliver, the embryopathies are 3 to 4 times higher. So absolutely.
Okay. So next slide, please. Let's go ahead then. Now, okay. So I'm going to ask Dr. Jugal this. What about, can you give us some ideas about diagnosing type 1 and type 2 diabetes?
Yeah. So type 1, when it comes to the clinical phenotype, will be usually lean person, will not have signs of insulin resistance, which you will see in type 2, that is acanthosis nigricans, which is very well visible on the neck. Type 1 will be lean, type 2 is usually going to be obese. Type 1 usually present with very high florid sugars, usually in DKA, especially if their sugars start with more than 300, and they will come to you with ketosis, very high ketosis, not normal that you would see 1+ in sometimes in pregnancy. And I think these are the most important clues. And finally, they may not have a very strong family history as well of type 2 diabetes in the family. You may have just an incidental type 1 diabetes, and they're usually in the younger age, though you have latent onset type 1s also, which are post 25, but they are far and few. Differentiating between type 2 and gestational diabetes, I feel this is always going to be a continuum. Type 2 usually is going to be predated. Gestational is usually when we say it starts with 24 to 28 weeks. As Sangeeta ma'am said before, insulin resistant becomes the common denominator between the gestational and type 2. So if it predates your pregnancy, it is type 2. If it starts, it is gestational, and then you have a very high future risk of type 2 diabetes as you go ahead with gestational.
Okay, so that's excellent. And let's go ahead now to the next area. And this is exactly what you said, that it's difficult to distinguish between pre-gestational type 2 and GDM because they have all this. Now, just a little word about the fasting hyperglycemia. Do you think that we should be vigilant about this? This is Dr. Jugal.
Fasting hyperglycemia, ma'am. So fasting hyperglycemia actually indicates how your liver is metabolizing your sugar. So we take a fasting sugar very differently than a PP sugar. PP sugar is usually the pancreas secretion defect much more than the liver defect. So when you have a fasting hyperglycemia, it means there is more insulin resistance rather than just a secretory defect there.
So sometimes we see patients with a high fasting and then a normal PP.
Normal PP, yes, ma'am.
How do you interpret that?
So, ma'am, for them, the problem is more at the site of insulin resistance, that is the liver. So this is one patient that I'm going to be more comfortable putting them on metformin and do their exercises a little better, if there are no other obstetric contraindications, and they would do really well when it comes to getting their fastings under control.
Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'm going to ask Dr. Shilpa this now, and this is regarding the first trimester screening. So can gestational diabetes, GDM, affect first trimester screening, or basically diabetes affect first trimester screening? Because there is a column in the form which says diabetes, yes or no.
Yeah, very well said, madam. Whenever we are giving our forms of first trimester screening, please mention whether whether she is diabetic or not, because that is going to affect the statistical calculation, and the risk calculation will be totally different if we do not write GDM or just diabetes in that form. So one important message is, please enter whether she is diabetic or not in your first trimester screening form. Now, GDM affects both the parameters, both PAP-A and beta-HCG. So beta-HCG and PAP-A in GDM, basically it goes down. So both the parameters are decreased in diabetes, and that is how it will affect the calculation. So we have to definitely enter, and it will affect the calculation. Fetal malformations, we've already discussed. Yes, fetal embryopathy and fetopathy. So malformations in GDM, we know that the most important ones are cardiovascular, and though the different one is caudal regression syndrome and sacral urgenesis. So, but they are not the commonest. They're particularly seen in diabetic, not gestational, but in diabetes in pregnancy.
Right.
So, so the commonest are the cardiovascular, and in cardiovascular we see TGA, we see VSD, ASD, and PDA. So these are the commonest malformations in diabetes, apart from nervous system and renal problems.
So would you say that a fetal echo is definitely recommended for all these patients?
100%, yes.
Definitely, yes. Now, what about the second trimester screen and alpha fetoprotein?
So now, with the advent of a better ultrasound machine, where we are seeing all types of neural tube defects on ultrasound, so this measurement as of today is not that important, because we are not missing any neural tube defects or nervous system disorders in pregnancy. So doing a separate alpha fetoproteins in gestational diabetes as of today is not indicated if we have a good machine and a good ultrasound.
So you'd say a first trimester screen followed by an anomaly scan and followed by a fetal echo at about 22, 24 weeks.
Definitely, yes.
Next slide, please. Can we go ahead then? Yeah.
So,
yeah. Go ahead, Shilpa.
Yeah, so as we said, less than 7%, no increased risk for anomalies. 7 to 8.5 is 5%, and more than 10% is 1 in 4. So that is 20%. So that is how HbA1c is related to malformations.
Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. So I think this is what Dr. Jugal has already discussed, that HbA1c in the first trimester is okay, but not very useful in the second and third. Next slide, please. Yeah. So now we've discussed about the 18 to 20 weeks anomaly scan and the fetal echo. And I'm going to ask Dr. Sangeeta first, how do you monitor your patients? Sangeeta, you're on mute.
Okay, we do the regular blood tests, all the blood tests in the first trimester, and a dating scan, viability scan. Then in the at 12 to 14 weeks, we will do the sonography for the nuchal translucency and the first trimester screening. If required, we would do a 16 weeks a quadruple test, but that is only if it is really required. At 18 to 20 weeks, we do the anomaly scan. And as Shilpa said, we would do fetal echo for all those who are detected to have diabetes, or those who have a glucose intolerance now, or have been detected to have GDM now. And after that, we would do a regular sonography at 26 to 28 weeks. And we'll do some blood tests, again, the CBC, thyroid, sugars, and the OGTT, the fasting and the 75-gram glucose, and then check the sugars again. So that would be the screening at 28. And subsequently, the sonographies would be at around 32 to 34 weeks. And everything else will depend upon how the situation is going. We would advise the patient to be monitoring her sugars every week at home. She would do a few sugars. If they are under control, accordingly, we keep titrating the medication or the insulin, whatever she is on. And
so we'll come to the treatment in a bit, Sangeeta. But before that, I'm going to ask Shilpa, you know, sometimes in practice, we find patients whose abdominal circumference is greater than the 70th centile. They have polyhydramnios, but the sugars are still normal. So do you think that these are gestational diabetics?
Yeah. So yes, because ultrasound markers to diagnose gestational diabetes are very, very important. So whenever I have a patient whose sugars are normal, but now I have an ultrasound report which is showing polyhydramnios, which is showing AC, which is going above 70th centile. So
Right.
maybe that one particular test which I have done is not showing any high sugars. That doesn't mean there might be some impaired glucose, which I need to again recheck and do her sugars again to see whether it is having any association with that.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask Dr. Vinit Samdani, at what stage should we involve you as a neonatologist?
So we come into play only when the mother is ready to deliver. So that's the time you need to involve us. Number two, important things that we need to know is gestational age, expected fetal weight, and if there is any congenital anomaly, so we are ready for combating the complications that come.
Okay. Yeah. And Dr. Jugal, can you explain how we sometimes see polyhydramnios? That means baby has polyuria, and we see, macrosomia, but the sugars are normal.
So, ma'am, I think this phenomenon is basically hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance related. And as Shilpa ma'am pointed out very well, we are probably missing the high sugar somewhere. And what we've realized is sometimes it's only the 1 hour, value which is coming abnormal for the patient. And generally, what the dictum is we do is, pre-meal and 2 hours post-meal. A lot of times we find this in the OGTT also when we are doing only the 1 hour value is abnormal. And the patient maintains to have that the 2 hour values always remain normal. So I think these are some patients where you may get the polyhydramnios and probably they have an abnormal 1 hour value, which is more than 140 is where, we realize that there is a problem.
Yeah. So I think these are the patients where we really need to do the 0, 1 hour, 2 hour levels.
And
yeah?
even
I mean, the full OGTT. Okay, let's go ahead. Next slide, please. Yeah. So now I'm going to come to an area, and that's a very interesting area, and that's of medical nutritional therapy. And I'm going to ask Dr. Jugal Garra to give us a few tips about how we can counsel our patients.
Okay. So usually the way we plan it is we need to first assess the diet of the patient. A lot of times what we've realized is 70-80% of the patients do just well on MNT, especially the pure GDMs diagnosed in the second, third trimester, because they have been eating a lot of junk. And I think it becomes like a happy period of pregnancy where they are overfed by the in-laws and everyone. So most of the times taking a good recall and you realize if you just take out that junk, half of your problems are solved there. Yeah, after that, a lot of guys still remain. So for them, what we usually plan is a 6 to 7 meals in the day. That is 3 major meals. That is your breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and 2 or 3 small snacks spaced out in the entire day. And we try and make sure that the carbs are roughly more than 175 to 180 grams per day to prevent any ketosis. So you don't have that. And the proteins are somewhere around 70 to 80 grams per day, which is what is required. We need to factor in the weight of the patient, the BMI of the patient, especially the pre-pregnancy BMI and pre-pregnancy weight, and how much of weight gain has happened. A lot of times patients come to us at 24 or 25 weeks where they've already gained 13 or 14 kgs. And once you put them on therapy, just with medical nutrition therapy, they start reducing a kg or 2, which I think is pretty okay. And then they stabilize there till the 32nd week, and then they start gaining again.
But if they lose weight in pregnancy, my God, there will be they will change the doctor.
No, so I think that is what needs to be counseled to them, that, this has been an abnormal weight gain, 12 kgs or 13 up to 24 weeks is a little abnormal, especially if you are a BMI of more than 23 to start with. And then tell them, that it is going to happen. And I think that should be okay.
That should be good. Yes. So I'm going to ask Dr. Sangeeta, do you think that a BMI should be taken at the booking visit? And we should counsel them about weight gain right from the beginning?
Yes, absolutely. whether a patient has diabetes, GDM or not, because at first visit you don't know who's going to be GDM.
Correct.
We have high risk and low risk patients, but irrespective, we should take the BMI and we should be counseling about weight gain and about diet as far as possible.
Yeah. So right from the beginning, if we are vigilant, that will help them. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, I think Dr. Jugal has described all this. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to ask Dr. Jugalkar, this patient is on medical nutrition therapy. How are we going to monitor the patient?
Okay, so usually what we do is
next slide.
Usually what we do is a 6-point profile most of the time, where we are checking the pre and post breakfast, lunch and dinner. What we target is all the pre-meals, including the fasting, to be less than 95 and the 2-hour values post meals to be around 120. A lot of guidelines even suggest fasting and the 3 post meals are also more than enough. And I think if your sugar control is good for say 2 weeks or so, I think we can reduce the amount of pricks for the patient and individualize it as required. And once in 10 or 14 days is usually I prefer doing a fasting and a post lunch from the lab as well, because sometimes the glucometer values can go really berserk and you may think it may be normal, but maybe a little higher and vice versa as well. So it's always better that once in 2 weeks we do the lab values as well.
But do they need to do every day, post breakfast, post lunch, post dinner, or can they do it?
Ma'am, initially we do that for at least 10 to 14 days because that helps sinking in the medical nutrition therapy. So they realize that, if I'm eating this, this is what is, higher fluctuations in the sugar as well. So initially, yes.
Initially, yes. Okay. Now, what about the role of oral hypoglycemics? When would you add?
So normally for our routine GDMs, we give them 10 to 14 days for the medical nutrition therapy to sink in.
Right.
If the sugars were not very high to start with, in those 14 days, they're going to measure almost 6 days in the week. If you find almost 1/3 of the values, of all the 14 days being more than the target that we've set for, then I think it becomes time that you plan for some form of intervention, either metformin or insulin, depending on which one is on the higher side.
So how would you decide between metformin or insulin?
So currently, as I've been saying, the pre-meals and the fasting, if they're high, the metformin is probably going to do a little better. Obviously, not that the after meals don't come down with the help of metformin, but insulin is something, if you have very high post meals, that is, more than 120, like 150, 180, then it's better to put the patient directly on insulin on, the NovoRapid as in the case capsule that the patient was on.
Yeah. Dr. Shilpa, what is your view on metformin in pregnancy?
Yeah, so basically, if you ask me, I'm very pro-insulin.
Next slide.
So I'm very much pro-insulin, but yes, there are patients and there are conditions or scenarios where we can start metformin on them.
Next slide.
And sorry?
No, you go ahead.
Yeah. So we have like, if suppose I have a patient who's in 2nd or 3rd trimester, who's in the late second trimester, then I might think of starting metformin for her instead of insulin. If she's in early gestation, yes, I would want her to be on insulin and not metformin, because I really want a good control and I don't want to take any chance with the metformin, whether she will get controlled or not. So I'll trust more insulin more in that case. And there is a study actually, which is a mixed study, where is metformin in pregnancy and it is versus insulin. So that study was conducted with metformin versus insulin. And actually the results, the outcome with both of them were equal. So that was a very good study, which actually built up the confidence in metformin. So we actually started prescribing metformin for them. And so given a choice, I would definitely go for insulin. But yes, if the patient has some injection phobia or not very compliant with injections, I might think of giving metformin.
So Dr. Vinit, I'm going to ask you now. Yes, Sangeeta, I'll just ask Dr. Vinit and then come to you. What about oral hypoglycemics and the neonate?
total hypoglycemics and the neonate.
Yes. Any, does it worry you if the mother has been on, say, metformin when she delivers?
No,
Or does
so
it
we
not?
don't.
No.
No, so we're not worried about what the mother is on. As long
Mm.
as the sugars are well controlled, our neonatal effect, neonatal complications are at the minimum.
Okay, okay. Yeah, Shilpa, sorry, Sangeeta, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so since we're talking of GDM and Shilpa said she's pro-insulin, I thought I will say I am very pro-metformin
Metformin.
because, you know,
I was sure that I'm opening a bag of worms where everybody is going to.
Yes.
So
Go ahead.
I see a lot of PCOS patients, and a lot of PCOS patients are on metformin, and it definitely has a very big role to play in PCOS. So when these PCOS patients get pregnant, most of the time we continue the metformin right up to 12 weeks. Now we are talking of GDM, which we are going to discover in the second and third trimester. And these patients of PCOS are already high risk for GDM. So there is a fair chance that they are going to have GDM, they are going to manifest it. And therefore, then the question comes, should we really be stopping the metformin at 12 weeks? So I have been cautious. Of course, we all tread in the cautiously, and I tend to continue the metformin even in second trimester and third trimester if she already was taking it. Because the fact that she was taking it, she got pregnant and she managed to maintain her sugars, then it is sensible to continue and keep the sugars under control. Secondly,
okay, so I'm going to
data on metformin being causing teratogenic effects. There are concerns for long-term safety, but there is no proven data one way or the other.
Right, right. So I'm going to ask Dr. Jugal Garg this, that if we have a patient of PCOS who's on metformin, who say a BMI of 29 or 30 or 32 and she becomes pregnant, do we stop the metformin, or in your opinion, should we continue? And the other scenario is when it's a lean PCO who gets pregnant.
Okay. So, ma'am, first of all, as I would concur with Sangeeta, ma'am, we would have loved to continue the metformin, but evidence is against it. So once you have conceived, whether you're obese or you're lean, the metformin does not prevent future GDM. It does not get down your risk of future GDM. I mean, we would have loved it because it makes sense, especially in the obese, that you're cutting out on the insulin resistance, but evidence is against it. So most guidelines tell that if the PCOS patient has conceived and she was on metformin and she was not diabetic, the sugars were not impaired, and it's only because of PCOD they were started, you should discontinue the metformin. Probably when she becomes the GDM, you can restart them on metformin. The only trend here, as Shilpa ma'am was saying, insulin and metformin, we have this fight in the endocrine group most of the times. But metformin does cross the placenta, and we don't know the long-term effects on the fetus or on the baby as they grow. There is the MIG, and then there is the MIG tofu study where
next slide.
They have seen the body weight and the fat distribution. When we were expecting the fat distribution to be better, it wasn't so. So long-term data for metformin is missing. But yeah, it's a very handy and a good drug, keeps you off insulin. And I think with the MIG data, almost 60 to 70% patients were controlled on metformin, so only 30% required insulin. So it takes away a lot of responsibility from all of us, and hypoglycemia and all that scare goes off.
I was just going to come to that the first thing that worries me is hypoglycemia. So starting a patient on insulin is a difficult thing, and if an oral drug can do it, which does not cause hypoglycemia, then why not?
Yes, ma'am.
Why not? So would you say that the first line we should be starting metformin?
So most of our patients do go on metformin, but yeah, if the glycemia is really high, sometimes we get GDMs with 250 of fasting.
Oh no, that's true.
Then you really need to start everything together and get the sugars aggressively under control.
So,
yeah,
so just can I ask?
Yeah,
Dr.
sure. Next slide.
Yeah. So Dr. Jugal, you're taking the metformin as your first line in all the trimesters?
So ma'am, if the patient is obese, overweight, and with a lot of insulin resistance, yes. But yeah, if you have someone who's really lean and only GDM, I would prefer putting that patient on insulin rather than metformin. So I don't want her to lose more weight, which, the metformin would do.
Okay. So we have one question from Dr. Pratibha Kulkarni in West Bengal, who says, apart from the OGTT, which test is more relevant in GDM, fasting sugar or post-lunch sugar? Dr. Jugal, would you like to answer that?
Both of them have their own relevance. And I
So
think,
that's not, yes, it's
yeah,
not one or the other.
yeah, you have to do both.
Okay. So what I'm saying is, now we go to Dr. Sangeeta. What are the maternal complications?
So maternal complications are the risk of miscarriage, preterm labor. There is a very fair chance of having a large baby, and that puts her at the high risk of difficult labors, obstructed labors, instrumental delivery, and perineal tears, because she would have instrumental delivery, or increases the risk of cesarean sections. And because of large babies, they can have uterine atony, postpartum hemorrhage, and of course in the long term they tend to develop diabetes, overt diabetes. So there are multiple complications across the whole spectrum of.
Okay, so very interesting question coming in from Dr. Bhavin is, what is the role of myoinositol with combination with metformin? Dr. Jugal, would you like to take that?
Yeah, so there are, I think, 2 or 3 good studies on myoinositol in treatment of GDM. They've shown small benefit, but as of now, none of the bodies have approved myoinositol as a treatment. Though there are very few small studies, I don't think that becomes a basis that we can put the patient on myoinositol.
Okay. And there's another question from Dr. Avijit Sarkar in West Bengal, is that what is the maximum allowed dose of metformin? So maybe you can tell us how to start metformin, what dose, and would you prefer sustained release or?
No, so ma'am, either is okay. We've been using both. So the only advantage with the sustained release is the GI side effects are far fewer. So we usually start with 1 tablet in the night for.
So is that a 500 you're talking about?
Yeah, the 500. Sorry,
500,
500 mg. You start
and
with
before food or after food?
After food, ma'am. We usually
after food.
Give it after food. 500 post the meal. Start with once a day. I mean, once in the night for 3 days. Then slowly step it up to twice a day. And then if required, up to 3 times is what usually I give. I usually don't like to jump up, though the approved dose is up to 2 grams.
So 1500 to 2 grams. Now, some doctors feel that if you give it 15 to 20 minutes before eating, then it also suppresses the appetite. Is that true?
No, ma'am. So the entire suppression of the appetite is a very different mechanism. Ideally, if you read the pharmacology books, they say metformins to be given pre-meals. But when we've been giving it after meals for so many years, the effect remains the same. What changes is the GI side effects, which become far fewer if you are taking it post meals, especially the acidity part of the story.
Okay. So
any contraindications for metformin, Dr. Jugal?
Contraindications would be eGFR, which is low, or you are having hepatic dysfunction of some sort. And patients whom you deem they are a little catabolic, low BMIs 18 to 20, I usually tend to not put them on metformin, even if they have very mild GDMs.
Okay. So Shilpa, what about I think fetal complications you have discussed. I'm going to ask Dr. Vinith now. What about the neonatal complications? Next slide.
Yeah, so I'm again saying that infants born to diabetic mothers have increased risk of congenital anomalies and also have a significantly higher morbidity and mortality in comparison to non-diabetic mothers. Now, the neonatal complications are a vast gamut. We have congenital anomalies, prematurity, respiratory distress, perinatal asphyxia, macrosomias, which lead us to difficult deliveries and birth injuries. We have metabolic complications of hypoglycemia, hypomagnesemia, hypocalcemia. We have some hematological complications such as polycythemia and hypoviscosity. We have hypobilirubinemia, and we have cardiac issues with PGA, VSDs, cardiomyopathies, and a very rare entity as a short colon syndrome also.
Okay. So I'm going to, next slide, please. Yeah. And Shilpa, tell me what about the antepartum and intrapartum complications?
Yeah. So basically, diabetes brings with it along others problem, and that the most important one is preeclampsia. So whenever I have a diabetic mother, I usually tell them to have a home BP monitoring, because we usually can see a development of preeclampsia in such females. And yes, polyhydramnios, and then unstable lie, UTI. So every trimester I do urine routine microscopy for all my diabetic mothers, and also a urine culture to rule out any asymptomatic bacteriuria. So that I usually do at 16 to 18 weeks, and especially in diabetics, because I'm really want to rule out any urinary tract infection in such patients. And they are, because of polyhydramnios and macrosomia, they are at risk of preterm labor, and also along with infection more common in them. That is one of the more etiology for preterm labor. For intrapartum, as Dr. Sangeeta already mentioned, because of the uterine enlargement, they are at risk of postpartum hemorrhage and atony, and leading to hemorrhage again, prolonged labor because of macrosomia, operative deliveries, cesarean sections, and yes, shoulder dystocia.
Okay. Yes. So a whole gamut of complications, and we really have to be very, very vigilant. Next slide, please. Yeah. So now, I think you've also described these. We'll also go into the long-term complications. And Sangeeta, would you like to discuss the long-term implications for these women who have been gestational diabetic?
Yeah, so patients who have diabetes during pregnancy, it not only affects her, but it is going to affect her fetus as well, her newborn baby as well. So diabetes is going to, affect 2 generations. And
Right.
the patient herself, there's a fair chance that she will have overt diabetes in the future. And it would, of course, impact the next pregnancy if she has any more after the current pregnancy. It will also increase the chances of blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, and in this patient. Plus, the GDM is going to affect the newborn fetus. We know that these babies are also tend to have impaired glucose tolerance or diabetes when they grow up. And I'm sure Dr. Samdani would.
Yes, I was just going to ask Dr. Vinith, when a child comes to you, do you ask whether the mother has been diabetic?
So it depends. If he comes to our clinic with we just ask, actually speaking factually, we just ask for the obstetric history. We never ask for diabetes in the mother, unless we see subtle signs of obesity, or we detect a hypertension, or routinely we screen kids at 5, 10, and 15 years as a gamut of investigation just to rule this out.
So what do you screen them with? What tests do you do?
So normally at least in my clinic, I do a thyroid profile, I do SGPT, I do vitamin D, B12, and a urine routine. So urine routine is good enough to catch a subtle diabetes.
Okay. All right. Next slide, please.
Can I ask a question to Dr.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Dr. Samdani, do you see these today, the kids, they are in demand of fast foods and cheesy things, etc. And there are some children who behave very, very difficult to handle if you do not give them what they want in that food items. Craving is so bad. Do you think that is a sign for them to be developing diabetes, or they could be diabetic? Is that an indicator?
No, madam, that's not an indicator. But what usually happens is the fault is with young parents like us, because I think post 1 year, something that should be followed by everybody is a family meal. It means the child doesn't get an a la carte menu. The child gets served to what we are eating, and that should be healthy. And maybe once a week junk is allowed. But most of the houses, how they run is that the parents eat a different meal and the child eats a child-friendly meal. So after 2.5, 3 years, he goes on to junk and no vegetables and greens.
Okay, so we have a question now from the audience, and that Dr. Rekha from Karnataka is asking, patient is on medical nutritional therapy. her fasting is 95 to 100. Should we start her on metformin or insulin? There is no macrosomia. Dr. Jugal.
Yeah, so if we've confirmed it with the lab values and they're still remaining more than 95, I think if the 2-hour value is okay, I would just put in 1 tablet of metformin and see, because you are definitely off target. So as you keep on increasing your fasting values more than 95, the odds ratio of getting into one of the perinatal complication increases. So yeah, if we've confirmed it on the lab sugars also, and it's a consistent thing that she's touching 100, 102, 98, then we would treat it by just putting her on small dose of metformin.
Okay, and any other oral hypoglycemic drug other than metformin, Dr. Avijit Sarkar is asking.
So glyburide has been used before. There are good studies on it, but as such, we are not something very pro for it, because the hypoglycemia risk with glyburide is very high.
Next slide, please.
Glyburide crosses the placenta to a very good extent, and we don't know whether it can even cause fetal hypoglycemia as well. So that is one thing that we are worried about with metformin. Even though if it crosses the placenta, it does not affect the fetus so much, is what we've realized. But with glyburide, that is a little bit of a problem. But yeah, there are studies with glyburide, especially in the African countries, where they've, rather than using insulin, they've used 1.25 to 2.5 mg of glyburide very nicely for managing the GDMs.
Dr. Jugal, sorry. Cost-wise, what is the difference, metformin and glyburide?
Oh, so currently your metformin, your glycomed costs 13 to 15 rupees a strip of 10 tablets. And the downhill, that is the glyburide only available, because there are 2 types of glyburide actually would be somewhere around, I think, 8 rupees or 5 rupees a tablet. So cost-wise, it's not much of a difference between metformin and glyburide. But yeah, if you're not controlled well on metformin and you need to put on an insulin, a lot of guys have used glyburide as that small sulfonylurea, which can increase the insulin secretion.
Okay, so let's go ahead now, and there's some questions regarding exercise. So Shilpa, you want to take that question? What about exercise?
Yeah, so exercise definitely is one of the treatment modality in gestational diabetes. So we have nutritional therapy, we have exercise, and we have drugs. So yes, it is one of the important component, and most important is walking. I think Dr. Jugal also will agree with that the brisk walking, and mostly after meals, is what is recommended, and that should be enough for your exercise. At least 5 times a week is what we should be telling them. Is that right, Dr. Jugal?
So as you said, ma'am, what we advise is post breakfast, lunch and dinner, just 15 minutes of walk if there are no obstetric contraindication every day, really gets down the post-meal sugars into well control. So
okay.
I think
15 minutes is enough for them.
Yeah. For 15. So it comes to 45 minutes in the day. But you know how it's so difficult now. There's lockdown, where to walk, how to walk.
So, ma'am, all my diabetics, I mean, GDM or non-GDM, if they are girls and they are little young or, less than 50, I make them do Zumba. They can either walk in their rooms or in their halls. I mean, you can do that. You just motivation. There are people who are walking only in the gallery.
Yeah, no, I also feel that you can just see YouTube workout and do 30 minutes and you really need hardly, a few square foot of space. You really don't need that much space. So there is another question, and that's from Dr. Bhavin, who says, what about metformin and Levemir combination?
So Levemir is an approved injectable therapy for GDMs. It is an approved one like your NPH. So NPH and Levemir are the intermediate or the long-acting insulin that we use. It gives you a good cover for roughly 12 to 14 hours. So we usually keep it twice a day, especially with the type 2 diabetes with gestation rather than the GDMs. And metformin is always been there. So if you still don't get a fasting control after putting the metformin, we usually try adding one NPH or Levemir shot.
Okay, so let's go ahead now and change gear a little bit. And this is now a patient who's been on insulin And I remember Dr. Jugal telling me that, if sometimes the insulin requirement starts decreasing in the third trimester. How do we interpret that?
Yeah. So ma'am, somewhere around 34 weeks, I think the insulin resistance starts coming down, which was at its peak somewhere around 24 to 26 weeks. And that is the time there is a sudden drop in the sugars. And especially if your patient is on insulin, you need to be a little careful, because the chances of hypoglycemia and sudden fetal demise is known and in that period with the GDM. So it's the insulin resistance, it's the physiology of pregnancy which suddenly changes that time.
Does it have anything to do with placental function?
Yes, I think there are certain changes in your HPL hormone, which is going to increase more of fat transfer and less of glucose transfer, which could be one of the causes.
Just to add on it, if at all my patient was on, suppose 12 units of insulin 3 times a day, and suddenly now at 36 her sugars are maintaining with around say 8 units, so I should actually be not happy about it. I should start thinking in terms of placental insufficiency. So a decrease in insulin requirement towards delivery is actually an indicator of a placental insufficiency, and we might think in terms of of delivering that mother rather than continuing with the pregnancy.
Okay. So let's go ahead now. And that's why close monitoring is important, with Doppler and NST and everything, just like Dr. Sangeeta said. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I think we've discussed this, but any disadvantages of insulin?
Only one, that is hypoglycemia.
Hypoglycemia. And how do we tell our patients to manage this?
So ma'am, first is educating the symptoms of hypoglycemia. A lot of times they just go on with increased hunger, and rather than getting into that severe one, that increased hunger is also something very important to catch up, because a lot of time patients says, no, I just get up in the night, I feel hungry and I eat. And basically what is happening is the sugars are dropping. They may not get the tremors and the sweating and all the sympathetic, parasympathetic symptoms that we usually want to know them to have. So hypoglycemia education, and then how to correct it. I think simple to keep a small glucose tab is now very easily available. It has around 4 to 5 grams of glucose. You can just pop in 3 glucose tabs together. It's 15 grams of sugar. Recheck your sugars after 10 minutes. If they were less than 70, whether they're going above 100. If it's your normal meal time, you can directly have your meal if it's your breakfast, lunch, dinner. If not, maybe just have a glass of milk with 2 biscuits, and the sugars would be good for another 3-4 hours. And after an hour, you can just recheck and confirm that the hypoglycemic event is gone.
What sugar level you consider as hypoglycemia?
Less than 70, ma'am.
70, huh? Okay. So I think that's very, very helpful tips for us, because, the patients may be under the endocrinologist, but they come to us with the problems. So I think that is, yes, really very helpful for us, and we can put it into our practice. Next slide, please. I think we are running a little now out of time. So I think the next slide, please. We have discussed this, and we have discussed oral hypoglycemia as well. Next slide, please. Yeah. So next slide, please. Yeah. Now we come to the most important, and that is also the timing of delivery. So Sangeeta, I'm going to ask you, what is your view on timing of delivery?
So if she's very well controlled just on diet and sugars are well maintained, then I will wait till term. But if she is on medication, is on insulin, or then in that case, I would like to do an induction or a planned delivery at 38 weeks. I will induce if she's inducible. If not inducible, I will consider elective section. And of course, if there are other factors such as hypertension or macrosomia, etc., then in those cases, I would again induce or do elective section at 38 weeks. But I will take a call at 38 and okay, if required.
Yeah. So Shilpa, I'm going to ask you, what about the role of steroids? Very often we have to give steroids in these diabetic patients. So what do you think?
I definitely, steroids play a very important role, because the maturity is always on the lower side for them. So if they are on insulin, I'll admit them and give steroids, because their insulin requirement is going to go high, and I have to monitor their sugars. And if they're on well-controlled on diet, I might have to give them insulin for 2-3 days when I'm giving steroids to them. So yes, monitoring of sugars is very important, and I might have to give insulin to cover that period of 2 to 3 days post steroids.
So we can continue giving it, but we have to be vigilant about the sugars.
Absolutely.
Okay, now what about induction or elective section? Shilpa, what do you feel?
There will be many factors I will have to take into consideration before
Next
I decide
slide.
whether I will go for induction or I have to go for a cesarean. So the main important things is basically whether she is primary, she's previous cesarean, what is her obstetric history, what is the fetal weight, what are the other complementary factors like preeclampsia, or she's got any other obstetric indications for delivery. So taking in total, I will, and then depending on her cervical status, so everything in total, I will decide what method I will use.
Okay, next slide, please. Next. So I think we've discussed this. Next slide, please. Let's go to intrapartum monitoring and sugar monitoring in labor. And I'm going to ask Dr. Jugal Gada. Here, the patient is on insulin. We are scheduling her for either an induction or elective section. She's on insulin. How do we manage?
So what we usually do is we keep the targets a little tight. It's 70 to 110, usually the control of sugar. We put them on IV insulin with a dextrose drip simultaneously, and 1 hour sugar monitoring is what is required. And we will titrate the insulin drip as per the sugar values, but a tighter control of 70 to 120 gives a better outcome in terms of neonatal hypoglycemia becomes a little lesser is what is known.
Okay, okay. So any do's and don'ts in labor, Shilpa?
Strict asepsis, definitely. And monitoring of sugars. I think these are the two important parameters for a mother in labor.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and monitoring, fetal monitoring, would you say that's also very important?
Partogram is very important. All females definitely should have a partogram and a continuous fetal monitoring if the facilities are available. Otherwise, intermittent auscultation is also.
At least intermittent fetal monitoring in labor
is also fine.
And Sangeeta, anything else you'd like to add for the labor management? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, if we have done an induction, then as Shilpa said, partogram is very important. We have to be very vigilant, keep an eye, and of course take a call to do a section when required. And if we are going through with a delivery, vaginal delivery, we must have analgesia in place, so that if you have to do a large episiotomy, you have to do instrumental deliveries, you are well prepared, and you have to ensure that you have your intravenous line available. Be prepared for uterine atony and PPH. So keep the blood ready, so be ready for PPH.
Okay. One of the tricky areas is preterm labor. And Shilpa, what do you feel about using beta mimetics and using for preterm labor in diabetics?
Yeah, so diabetics, because I will not be able to give beta agonist because they are going to increase the sugars. And so my choice for using tocolysis would be calcium channel blockers. So nifedipine would be my first choice of drug in these patients for any tocolysis if required. Yes, okay. Maxelf also, but my first choice is nifedipine.
Okay. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is, I think Dr. Jugal has also discussed how to monitor the blood sugars in during labor. Next slide, please. Yeah. What about the diet in labor? Dr. Jugal, anything you'd like to tell us?
Yeah, so if the patient is allowed to eat, they should be on a diabetic diet. A lot of times they're kept NBM and allowed only ice sips or water or something. So then we usually start a small dextrose drip so that their calorie intake is taken care of and ketosis doesn't happen.
Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, and insulin in labor, I think you have told us, but would you like to tell us again how to make the drip?
Yeah, so what we usually do is a D5, which goes on at 40 to 60 ml per hour. And the infusion is usually, if you have the infusion pump, you can have 50 units of normal saline and 55 units of insulin and start with 1 unit or 2 units. If you're using your normal pints, then you have to probably just do the math, 500 with 55, and then it becomes with the drip set at around 10 ml per hour or 20 ml per hour, and then you titrate it as you require. But it comes down to 1 to 2 units per ml per hour is usually what we start.
Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. And postpartum care, what about the insulin requirement? Now we deliver this patient, and how do we decide whether she has to continue metformin or continue insulin? Dr. Jugal?
Yeah. So, ma'am, what would be the crux is what happens prepartum. So, if you're on a very high dose of insulin that you are requiring, the doses do come down by almost 50 to 80%. But if the dose was really small, they probably go off the insulin completely. So it all depends. If the patient is LSCS, NBM for 12 to 18 hours, we continue with the drip and the IV insulin, and then slowly, as the NBM goes off, we start monitoring the sugar, try to get them off the insulin and see where their sugars lie, and then take a call on the insulin.
Okay. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think, yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. Okay, and the next slide. Yeah. So coming to Dr. Vinit Samdani, neonatal care, immediate care, and long-term effects.
So there are 2-3 points as a neonatologist we would want to know. One is the gestational age, the approximate birth weight. Yeah, the approximate birth weight and the anticipated, the approximate birth weight and any anticipated congenital anomalies and late complications of labor. Now, if everything is fine, so what we normally do is dry the airway, warm the baby, check the heart rate, oxygen saturation, respiratory rate, and the baby is roomed in with the mother with a sugar monitoring and skin to skin and breastfeeding. In case we have subtle signs where the baby is cyanosed, then we need to check whether it's a respiratory or a cardiac origin. If we have jitteriness, then we look into the glucose, polycythemia. Then in these cases, we take the baby to the NICU. Now, the long-term effects are, it's known that babies born to type 1 diabetic mothers have a 2% incidence of having type 1 diabetes in their life. And the ones which are with type 2 diabetes, possibly around the 3rd to the 4th decade, or close 25 to 30% of the children become diabetic. And there's also obesity. They can go on to syndrome X with hypertension. And there is little cognitive function issues. And usually it's the language that is usually affected.
Okay. Right. So we have a question from the audience just before we close. Dr. Shafali is asking that she has a patient who's 6 weeks pregnant and she is primary on insulin, long acting, twice a day, 20 units. What type of insulin should she be put on? Dr. Jugal?
She's she's already on long acting. I think Levemir and NPH do the trick well. So we would continue with that because these are the only 2 approved insulin. Glargine is approved only and only if someone has been on Glargine before the pregnancy. Then Glargine is allowed. Otherwise, I think NPH and Detemir are the only 2 approved long-acting insulin. And the Rapid, Novorapid, and the Actropid are the short-acting ones.
So, Dr. Jugal, should we not change this patient on short-acting for a better control?
No. So, ma'am, if your pre-meals are really high, then you will need the long-acting. If your post-meals are high, then you require the Novorapid or the Aspart or the Actropid.
Right. So a lot of questions coming in, some of them we have discussed: when to deliver the baby in well-controlled and poorly controlled mothers. Dr. P. Reena, we have discussed this. Dr. Sangeeta has said, until what gestation would you continue metformin? I think the answer is continue metformin till delivery and later as required. And we have Dr. Nalini who's asking, many patients while on initial screening show high glucose challenge test. If we do fasting and postprandial, then it comes normal. And HbA1c, everything is bang normal. So how do you proceed in those patients? So Dr. Jugal, would you like to discuss that? And then we will close.
Okay, so a lot of time we find this discrepancy because when you're eating a meal, there was something that we didn't get time to discuss. That was the glycemic index. So you're eating a meal which has protein, carbs, and fat together. When you're giving glucose, it's plain simple sugar, so it comes into the circulation also faster. So a lot of time we find this discrepancy, especially the 2-hour post meal sugar is much different than your post-hour 2-hour glucose on the OGTT. fasting should not change whether it's done randomly or unless until there is a discrepancy in the machine. So fasting should not be a problem, but yeah, post meals, I agree there is a problem because the glucose is different and the meal that we eat is completely different. So it can affect.
Okay. So I think with that, next slide, please. We are coming to the end and I'm going to ask, we have discussed this. Next slide, please. What about recurrence in subsequent pregnancy? Shilpa, would you like to say something?
Yeah, so when we have GDM in this pregnancy, we have to tell them that whenever she comes next, again in the next pregnancy, the incidence of having GDM is around 30 to 70%. So it is somewhere around 30 to 70%, and that is what the counseling should be. And developing of a type 2 diabetes is almost around 50%. So that is what we have to tell them, that yes, it is high recurrence.
It is high. And I'm very happy that Dr. Nandanwar is here and he has commented that atosiban is one of the best drugs for use of preterm labor in diabetics. That is true. And Dr. Shivani Goswami is asking what kg is the definition of macrosomia? So Shilpa, you want to take that?
Yeah, for Indian scenarios, we're taking 4 kg as our cutoff. Whereas outside it is 4.5. That is what ACOG and RCOG says. But yes, for Indian, it is 4 kgs.
Next slide, please. Yeah. And next slide, please. Yeah. So I'm going to ask Dr. Shilpa now to conclude our session. Thank you very much to all our panelists, to all our listeners. We've had a lot of nice messages. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have enjoyed it. And over to Shilpa for conclusion.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all the panelists. Thank you, madam. Thank you, Durusha, madam. This was really, I felt that 1.5 hours was actually less, and we really enjoyed everyone. Dr. Vinny, Dr. Jugal, Dr. Sangeeta, your inputs were really very valuable. Thank you so much for this. And yes, my thank you note is not complete if I do not thank our delegates who were there to listen to us. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Sarita madam. That was such a wonderful moderation. You've actually covered everything about GDM. Thank you so much. Our partners, our sponsors, USV, thank you for this. Definitely, Omnicuris, Shobit was all, Pinali, Shobit, we were all doing this. And the PCOS Society team, thank you so much for all making this a wonderful session. And I hope all the delegates also enjoyed and will be benefited by this. Now, there is a next webinar, which is on the 19th of June. And the next in the W3 series, which is fertility treatment for PCOS, and very interesting, IUI versus IVF, again by the PCOS Society of India. So see you all there on 19th in large numbers. Yes. These are the small videos which are for common people to understand in very simple way. So we will play the videos now.
So I think with that, we'll conclude the session. Yeah, Shobit, is that the last? Yes. To become a member of the PCO Society, you please log in pcoindia.org. And this program is brought to you by the PCOS Society of India with support from USV, makers of Glycomet SR. And this is a very, very popular What, When, Why W3 webinar series. Shilpa, would you like to have the last word?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Durusha, for giving us this opportunity, and thank you everyone for being there with us. Thanks a lot.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.